Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you got the short end of the stick? Maybe you were negotiating a salary, haggling over a price, or just trying to convince someone to see things your way, and it just didn't go as planned. You replay the conversation over and over in your head, thinking about what you could have said differently, how you could have steered it in your favor. We've all been there. And that's exactly why this book exists. Because negotiation isn't just about getting a better deal, it's about understanding human psychology, mastering communication, and learning how to guide any conversation toward the outcome you want. Never Split the Difference is not your typical negotiation book. This isn't some dry, textbook-style read filled with corporate jargon and generic advice. This is real-world wisdom from a man who spent years negotiating in the most high-stakes situations imaginable: hostage crises, terrorist negotiations, kidnappings. The author, Chris Voss, didn't learn these strategies from a classroom or a business seminar. He learned them while sitting across from some of the most dangerous people on the planet, convincing them to release hostages without a single bullet being fired. And what's truly fascinating is that these same strategies, the ones that worked in life-or-death scenarios, can be used in everyday life to get better results in business, relationships, and personal interactions. Chris Voss wasn't always an expert in negotiation. He started as a cop in Kansas City before working his way up to become the FBI's lead international kidnapping negotiator. Over the years, he saw that the traditional approach to negotiation, the logical, numbers-driven, meet in the middle mindset, was failing in the real world. Hostage takers didn't respond to logic. Dangerous criminals didn't care about fairness. And what he realized was that negotiation isn't about intellect or reasoning. It's about emotions, instincts, and psychology. It's about making people feel understood, getting them to reveal information without even realizing it, and guiding them toward decisions that benefit you. Since retiring from the FBI, Voss has taken everything he learned and applied it to the business world, working with Fortune 500 companies, entrepreneurs, and everyday people who want to negotiate better salaries, close deals, and handle difficult conversations with confidence. When Never Split the Difference was released in 2016, it quickly became a must-read because it flips everything you thought you knew about negotiation on its head. Instead of teaching outdated tactics like trying to sound dominant or pushing for compromises, this book shows you how to use tactical empathy, subtle verbal techniques, and psychological triggers to take control of any negotiation without the other person even realizing it. And let's be honest, negotiation isn't just for business deals and salespeople. It's a part of everyday life. You negotiate with your boss when you ask for a raise. You negotiate with your spouse when you decide where to go on vacation. You negotiate with your kids when they refuse to go to bed on time. The world is full of conversations where people are trying to get what they want, and if you don't know how to navigate those conversations, you're going to end up settling for less than you deserve. This book matters today more than ever because we live in a world where communication is everything. Whether you're dealing with a difficult customer, a tough business partner, or a personal conflict, knowing how to read people, guide conversations, and influence outcomes is one of the most valuable skills you can have. And here's the truth: most people are bad at negotiation. They focus too much on getting a quick yes, they give in too easily, or they avoid conflict altogether. But once you understand the strategies Chris Voss teaches, you'll see every conversation differently. You'll start noticing when people are trying to manipulate you. You'll know how to make someone feel like they're in control while steering them toward the decision you want. And most importantly, you'll never feel powerless in a negotiation again. So whether you're in business, sales, leadership, or just someone who wants to be a better communicator, this book is about to change the way you approach every conversation in your life. Chris Voss has spent years perfecting these techniques in some of the most dangerous situations in the world. Now, you get to use them to win negotiations in business, relationships, and everyday life. Are you ready to master the art of negotiation? Let's dive in. Let's start with Chapter 1, The New Rules: How to Become the Smartest Person in the Room. Negotiation is not what you think it is. Most people picture a negotiation as two people sitting across a table, throwing out numbers, making logical arguments, and eventually shaking hands on a fair deal. That's the old school way of thinking. But Chris Voss learned the hard way that logic and fairness don't always work, especially when you're dealing with criminals, terrorists, or desperate kidnappers holding a gun to someone's head. And if those tactics don't work in life or death situations, why would they work in the real world of business, relationships, or everyday life? Voss opens this book with a wake-up call. Traditional negotiation methods are broken. The idea that rational arguments and compromise lead to the best deals is a myth. Instead, negotiation is about emotions, human psychology, and making people feel like they're in control, while you're the one actually steering the conversation. He introduces a fundamental shift in thinking. Negotiation is not a battle of logic. It's a process of tactical empathy. The chapter starts with a gripping story from Voss's time in the FBI. It's the late 1990s, and he's part of an elite hostage negotiation team dealing with a high-stakes situation, a bank robbery gone wrong. 4 armed robbers have taken hostages inside a Chase Manhattan bank in Brooklyn, and the tension is through the roof. In a situation like this, every word, every pause, and every reaction matters. A wrong move could cost lives. At that time, the FBI still relied on the classic Harvard negotiation model, a system based on rational problem-solving, logical reasoning, and aiming for win-win outcomes. The problem? Hostage takers aren't rational. They don't care about logic. They're emotional, scared, aggressive, and unpredictable. So when Voss and his team tried traditional negotiation techniques, they quickly realized they were hitting a wall. That's when Voss started to develop a new approach, one that focused on human nature rather than numbers and logic. Instead of trying to overpower the robbers with facts or intimidation, they started using tactical empathy, a strategy that involved making the criminals feel heard, understood, and in control, all while subtly guiding them toward surrendering. The chapter then dives into one of the biggest negotiation mistakes people make, believing that negotiation is about convincing the other person with facts. Voss argues that this is where most people go wrong, whether in business, in sales, or even in relationships. People don't make decisions based purely on facts. They make decisions based on how they feel. If someone feels attacked, pressured, or cornered, they will resist, even if the logical choice is obvious. But if they feel understood, respected, and in control, they become far more open to influence. So how do you use this in everyday life? Voss introduces a powerful concept, the idea that being the smartest person in the room doesn't mean knowing the most. It means knowing how to make others feel heard. He explains that great negotiators don't dominate conversations. They don't bulldoze their way to a deal. Instead, they listen deeply, observe carefully, and ask the right questions at the right time. This doesn't mean being passive. It means using strategic silence, thoughtful responses, and subtle psychological techniques to control the flow of the conversation. The chapter ends with a key realization: the best negotiators don't try to win arguments, they try to build connections. And once you understand that negotiation is about emotions, not logic, you'll start seeing every conversation in a completely different way. Next is Chapter 2, Be a Mirror, How to Instantly Connect and Gain the Upper Hand. Most people think being a great negotiator means being a great talker, knowing what to say, having the perfect argument, and convincing the other person with logic. But that's completely wrong. The best negotiators aren't the ones who talk the most, they're the ones who listen the most. In this chapter, Chris Voss introduces one of the simplest, yet most powerful techniques in negotiation: mirroring. At first, mirroring might sound like some basic psychological trick, but don't underestimate it. When used correctly, it can build trust, lower defenses, and make people feel so comfortable that they start revealing key information without even realizing it. And in a negotiation, information is everything. Voss starts this chapter with a story about a kidnapping case he worked on in the Philippines. A group of armed rebels had kidnapped an American named Jeffrey Schilling and was demanding a ransom of $10 million. The situation was deadly serious. The kidnappers were unpredictable, and traditional negotiation tactics weren't working. Voss and his team needed a way to get inside the minds of these dangerous criminals, to guide them toward a peaceful resolution without escalating the conflict. So what did they do? They listened. And more importantly, they mirrored. Mirroring is one of the simplest negotiation techniques in the world, but it's also one of the most effective. It works by repeating the last few words that someone just said, in a calm, questioning tone. This does two powerful things. First, it makes the other person feel heard and understood, which lowers their defenses. Second, it encourages them to keep talking, giving you more information without you having to push for it. Think about it like this. Have you ever been in a conversation where you felt like the other person really got you? Where they seemed genuinely interested in what you were saying? That's what mirroring does. It creates a feeling of connection and rapport, something that's essential in any negotiation. The best part? It's so simple that the other person won't even notice you're doing it. When someone says, "We need to get this deal done by next week," and you respond with, "By next week?" they naturally start explaining why, giving you more insight into their needs and motivations. Voss explains that when people feel heard, they become more open to persuasion. It's human nature. Our brains are wired to trust people who listen to us. So instead of pushing your own agenda right away, let the other person talk first. Get them comfortable. Make them feel in control. And then, when they least expect it, guide them toward the outcome you want. Mirroring works in everyday situations too. If your boss says, "We don't have the budget to give you a raise right now," instead of arguing, just mirror, "You don't have the budget?" That simple response will often lead them to explain more, maybe revealing that the budget is tight for now, but might open up in a few months. Now, instead of getting shut down, you have more information to work with. One of the biggest mistakes people make in negotiations is rushing to respond. They feel the need to fill every silence, to defend their position, to argue their point. But Voss teaches that silence is one of your greatest weapons. After mirroring, let the other person fill the silence. People hate awkward pauses, and more often than not, they'll start talking just to break it, revealing valuable information in the process. By the end of this chapter, Voss makes one thing clear: negotiation isn't about overpowering someone with facts or arguments. It's about making them feel understood. When people feel like you're on their side, they stop seeing you as an adversary and start seeing you as a partner. And once that happens, they're far more likely to agree with you. Now, Chapter 3, Don't Feel Their Pain, label it, How to Use Tactical Empathy to Win Negotiations. Most people think that negotiation is about winning arguments, making the best case, or having the strongest facts. But that's not how human nature works. People don't make decisions based purely on logic, they make them based on emotions. And if you want to influence someone, you need to understand how they feel before you ever try to convince them of anything. That's where tactical empathy comes in. Chris Voss learned this lesson firsthand in some of the most dangerous hostage negotiations in the world. In this chapter, he shares a story from Haiti, where a group of kidnappers had taken a young American woman hostage. The kidnappers were demanding a massive ransom, and they weren't budging. The situation was tense. Most people in this scenario would try to reason with the criminals, explain why their demands were unrealistic, argue about fairness, or even threaten consequences. But that would have been a fatal mistake. Instead of arguing, Voss and his team did something completely different. They labeled the kidnappers' emotions. Labeling is one of the most powerful tools in negotiation. It works like this. When you recognize an emotion in the other person, fear, frustration, anger, doubt, you say it out loud. Not in a confrontational way, but in a way that makes them feel heard and understood. You don't say, "Calm down," or, "You're being unreasonable." Instead, you say something like, "It seems like you're frustrated," or, "It sounds like you're feeling unsure about this." That small shift in language changes everything. Here's why it works. When people feel an emotion, whether it's fear, frustration, or anxiety, they often can't process information clearly. But when you label that emotion for them, something powerful happens. Their brain slows down. They feel recognized. They feel validated. And when they feel like you understand them, they start trusting you. That's the first step toward guiding them toward the outcome you want. Voss explains that most of us are uncomfortable with emotions in negotiations. We try to avoid them. We focus on facts, numbers, and logic, hoping the other person will see reason. But ignoring emotions is a mistake. Emotions drive decision-making, and if you can't recognize, label, and address them, you'll never be able to truly connect with the person you're negotiating with. Labeling is ridiculously effective in everyday life, too. Imagine you're dealing with an angry customer. Instead of saying, "I understand your frustration," which sounds generic and dismissive, you say, "It sounds like you're really upset that this didn't meet your expectations." That subtle difference makes the customer feel like you actually get them. And once they feel understood, they're much more likely to calm down and work with you rather than against you. It works in personal relationships too. If your partner is upset, instead of getting defensive or trying to fix the problem immediately, you can label their emotions. "It seems like you had a really stressful day." That simple sentence can diffuse tension, build connection, and open the door for a productive conversation. One key rule Voss teaches in this chapter: when you label an emotion, be silent afterward. Say, "It seems like this situation is really frustrating for you." And then pause. Let them respond. The silence will feel awkward, but that's a good thing. The other person will usually start talking, revealing even more about what's really going on. By the end of the chapter, Voss makes it clear: the best negotiators don't ignore emotions, they use them. When you make someone feel heard, they naturally lower their guard. They stop seeing you as an opponent and start seeing you as an ally. And once that happens, they become far more open to your influence. Now, Chapter 4. That's right. The magic phrase that changes everything. What if I told you that there's a single phrase, a simple, two-word response, that instantly tells you when someone is fully on your side? A phrase that, once you hear it, means the person you're negotiating with is no longer resisting, no longer doubting, and is now mentally agreeing with you. That phrase is, "That's right." And in this chapter, Chris Voss explains why these two words are a game-changer in any negotiation. The chapter kicks off with a gripping story about a kidnapping in the Philippines. A group of criminals had taken a man hostage and was demanding a ransom. But instead of negotiating directly, they sent the hostage's wife on the phone to beg for her husband's release. She was emotional, desperate, and willing to say anything to save him. The kidnappers, on the other hand, were cold and dismissive. At first, the FBI's negotiation efforts were failing. The kidnappers weren't listening. But then Voss and his team changed their approach. Instead of making demands or arguments, they started summarizing the kidnappers' situation back to them, showing that they truly understood their perspective. They didn't agree with them, but they mirrored their emotions and put themselves in their shoes. And then, it happened. The lead kidnapper responded with, "That's right." That was the turning point. Those two words signaled that, for the first time, the kidnappers felt heard. They felt understood. And once that happened, the FBI had the leverage they needed to guide the negotiation in their favor. Voss explains that getting someone to say, "That's right," is one of the most powerful moments in any conversation. Why? Because it means they're not just agreeing with what you're saying, they're emotionally connecting with it. They're validating that you truly understand them. And when people feel understood, they become far more open to persuasion. Now, let's be clear. This is not the same as getting someone to say, "You're right." That's actually a bad sign. Think about it. How many times have you told someone, "You're right," just to get them to stop talking? Maybe you weren't actually convinced, but you just wanted to move on. That's why "you're right" is usually meaningless in a negotiation. It's surface-level agreement, not real buy-in. But when someone says, "That's right," it means they're internalizing your point as their own. They're not just agreeing, they're seeing things from your perspective. So how do you get someone to say it? Voss teaches that the key is to actively listen and then summarize their thoughts, emotions, and concerns in a way that resonates with them. You need to show them that you truly understand their position, not just the facts, but the emotions driving them. When you can summarize their own perspective better than they can, they will naturally say, "That's right." Let's break it down with a real-world example. Imagine you're in a salary negotiation with your boss. Instead of just stating your case and hoping they agree, you might say, "It sounds like the company is trying to manage costs carefully right now, and that giving raises is a tough decision. You need to balance rewarding employees with keeping the business profitable, and it's not an easy call." If your boss responds with, "That's right," then you know you've hit the emotional truth of the situation. Now, instead of pushing back, they're more likely to work with you because they feel understood. This technique works in business, relationships, and everyday life. If you're arguing with your partner, instead of trying to prove your point, try summarizing their emotions. "It seems like you feel like I haven't been paying enough attention to what's important to you, and that makes you feel unappreciated." If they say, "That's right," then the argument is no longer about who's right and who's wrong. It becomes about finding a solution together. By the end of this chapter, Voss makes one thing clear: persuasion isn't about pushing your point, it's about making the other person feel heard. And once they say, "That's right," you've won half the battle. Next is Chapter 5, The Power of No, How to Say No Without Killing the Deal. Most people are terrified of the word no. They see it as a dead end, a rejection, a roadblock that shuts down negotiations. But what if I told you that no is actually one of the most powerful words you can hear in a negotiation? Chris Voss flips the script in this chapter, showing us that no is not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning of real negotiation. The chapter opens with an intense hostage negotiation story. Voss was on the phone with a kidnapper who was refusing to cooperate. Every attempt to push him toward a solution was met with resistance. Then Voss did something unexpected. He gave the kidnapper permission to say no. Instead of pressuring him, Voss asked, "Do you want this situation to end badly?" The kidnapper responded with, "No." That was the turning point. It put the kidnapper back in control and made him more willing to talk. By giving him the chance to say no, Voss actually moved the negotiation forward. Why does this work? Because people are naturally defensive. When they feel pressure to say yes, they resist. But when you give them the freedom to say no, they feel safe, in control, and more open to continuing the conversation. Most of us have been trained to chase yes in negotiations. We think that the faster we get someone to agree, the better. But Voss explains that pushing for yes too soon actually backfires. People don't like feeling manipulated. When they feel like they're being cornered into agreement, their walls go up. But when they say no, they feel like they're protecting themselves, and paradoxically, that makes them more open to real discussion. So how do you use this in real life? Instead of asking questions that push someone towards saying yes, ask ones that invite no. Imagine you're trying to close a deal with a client. Instead of saying, "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" which pressures them to say yes, try, "Is now a bad time to talk?" It gives them control. If they say no, it means they're actually open to talking. Or let's say you're in a tough salary negotiation. Instead of saying, "Do you think I deserve a raise?" which puts them on the spot, you could ask, "Do you want to lose an employee who brings value to the company?" That forces them to consider the consequences, without making them feel cornered. Voss also shares a key technique, the no-oriented question. This is a question structured so that the best response for the other person is no, but in a way that actually helps you. Example: if you're following up with a client who hasn't responded, instead of saying, "Have you had a chance to review my proposal?" which pressures them to say yes or make an excuse, try, "Have you given up on this project?" The natural response is, "No, I haven't given up." And just like that, you've re-engaged them in the conversation. The key takeaway from this chapter? Stop chasing yes Embrace. No. When people feel in control, they become more open. And once they're open, real negotiation can begin. Next is Chapter 6, Bend Their Reality, the one word that creates urgency. Ever been in a negotiation where the other person just wouldn't budge? You throw out your best arguments, you make your most reasonable offer, and yet, they stall. They hesitate. They won't commit. Chris Voss explains that the problem isn't your offer, it's their perception of reality. If someone doesn't see a proposal as urgent, important, or beneficial, they'll drag their feet indefinitely. So how do you change their perception? How do you make them feel like saying, yes, is the best and only option? It all starts with one word. Fair. This chapter opens with a high-stakes business deal. A company was about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract when, at the last minute, the other side completely changed the terms. They tried to sneak in a worse deal, hoping Voss's client wouldn't notice. Instead of arguing, Voss's team used a simple, powerful phrase. We just want to make sure we're being treated fairly. Boom. Instant pressure. The other side backed off immediately. Why? Because no one wants to be seen as unfair. The moment you accuse someone, directly or indirectly, of being unfair, their defenses go up. They feel the need to prove that they're being reasonable. And that's exactly what you want. Voss explains that the word fair is one of the most powerful psychological triggers in any negotiation. People hate being seen as unfair, so they'll often adjust their behavior to avoid it, sometimes even against their own interests. But there's a right way and a wrong way to use this technique. The wrong way is to accuse someone directly, like saying, "You're being unfair." That immediately creates conflict. Instead, use soft, indirect language. "We just want to make sure we're getting a fair deal." Or if someone pushes a bad offer on you, ask, "How am I supposed to accept something that doesn't seem fair?" That makes them stop and rethink their position, without feeling attacked. This concept of bending reality goes beyond fairness. Voss also teaches a powerful trick called the illusion of control. People hate being told what to do. The more you push, the more they resist. So instead of pushing, pull. Ask calibrated questions, questions that force the other person to think and problem solve for you. For example, let's say you're negotiating the price of a product. Instead of saying, "That's too expensive," try, "How am I supposed to justify that price to my team?" Now, instead of shutting you down, they feel obligated to help you find a solution. You've given them the illusion of control, and that makes them more likely to work with you. By the end of this chapter, Voss makes it clear, negotiation isn't about force, it's about perception. When you subtly shift someone's reality, they start seeing things your way, without even realizing it. Now, Chapter 7, Create the Illusion of Control, How to Get What You Want Without Pushing. Ever had a conversation where someone kept shutting you down? No matter what you said, they dug in their heels and refused to budge? That's because people hate being told what to do. The moment they feel pressured, their instinct is to resist, even if what you're saying is completely reasonable. So how do you get people to agree with you, without making them feel like they're giving in? Chris Voss calls it the illusion of control. And in this chapter, he teaches how to guide a negotiation in your favor by making the other person feel like they're in charge, even when they're not. The power of how and what questions. Voss starts with a story from a hostage negotiation where a man had barricaded himself in a building with a gun. The situation was tense, and the usual approach, ordering him to surrender, wasn't working. So Voss switched tactics. Instead of telling the man what to do, he asked, "How do you want this to end?" That one question changed everything. Instead of resisting, the man actually started thinking about a solution. Why? Because instead of feeling forced, he felt like he was in control. Voss explains that in any negotiation, the key to influence is making the other person feel like the decision is theirs. And the best way to do that is by asking calibrated questions, questions that start with how or what. For example, let's say you're negotiating a contract. Instead of demanding better terms, you might ask, how can we make this work for both of us? Or if someone gives you a bad offer, instead of saying, that won't work for me, try, how am I supposed to accept that? That question forces them to rethink their position without feeling attacked. And the best part? It makes them start negotiating against themselves. The secret to handling tough negotiators. Voss also explains that difficult negotiators love feeling in control. If you push too hard, they'll shut down. But if you ask the right questions, they'll actually start making your case for you. Let's say you're negotiating a salary. Instead of saying, I deserve more, ask, what can I do to make this a no-brainer for you? Now, instead of resisting, they're thinking of ways to justify paying you more. You've turned the tables, without them even realizing it. Avoiding the yes trap. A lot of people think negotiation is about getting the other person to say yes as quickly as possible. But Voss warns against this. He explains that when people feel pushed into saying yes, they actually become more resistant. Instead, get them to say no first. It makes them feel safe, like they're in control. Then, once they feel comfortable, guide them toward your solution using how and what questions. By the end of this chapter, Voss makes one thing clear: real power in negotiation comes from making the other person feel like they're in charge. If you can master the illusion of control, you can influence anyone, without them even realizing it. Next is Chapter 8, Guarantee Execution, how to make sure people follow through. A deal isn't real until it actually happens. You can spend hours, even days, negotiating the perfect agreement, but if the other person doesn't follow through, it's worthless. This is one of the biggest frustrations in both business and personal negotiations. Someone gives you their word, they promise to deliver, but then, nothing. They stall, they disappear, or they suddenly change their mind. Chris Voss calls this the danger of yes without commitment. And in this chapter, he lays out exactly how to make sure people don't just agree but actually take action. He opens the chapter with a story about a real estate negotiation where a buyer kept saying yes to everything the seller wanted. On paper, the deal was done. But every time the seller tried to finalize the paperwork, the buyer delayed. The seller couldn't figure out what was happening. If the buyer agreed to the terms, why wasn't the deal moving forward? That's when Voss stepped in. Instead of asking, "Are you still good with the deal?" he asked a different question. "How do I know you'll follow through on this?" That single question changed everything. The buyer hesitated, which was the first sign that something wasn't right. By pushing for specifics, what steps needed to happen next, what obstacles might come up, and how they planned to address them, Voss exposed the fact that the buyer wasn't actually committed. They were saying yes just to keep the conversation going, not because they were ready to sign. Most people avoid conflict. They don't like saying no, especially if they want to keep the relationship friendly. So instead, they give vague agreements, saying yes but without any real commitment. Voss explains that to avoid getting caught in these situations, you have to test people's agreements. Instead of taking yes at face value, make them prove it. Ask, what steps do you need to take to make this happen? If they struggle to answer or give vague responses, that's a sign they're not actually ready to move forward. But if they provide clear, specific steps, that's how you know they're serious. Another trick Voss shares is something he calls the Rule of 3. He explains that getting someone to agree once isn't enough. People need to reinforce their own commitments, so the key is to get them to confirm it at least 3 times. The first time, they might just be going along with the conversation. The second time, they start thinking about it more seriously. But by the third confirmation, their brain is registering it as a real commitment. The trick is not to ask the same question 3 times in a row. That would feel unnatural. Instead, spread it out over the conversation. First, they say, "Yes, that works for me." A little later you ask, "Just to be clear, what parts of this agreement work best for you?" Then before wrapping up ask, "So what's the next step from here?" By the third time, they're locked in mentally, and they're far more likely to follow through. Voss also explains how to spot when someone is bluffing. If a person is serious about an agreement, their answers will be detailed. They'll outline exactly what needs to happen next. But if they're faking it, their responses will be vague, things like, "Yeah, we'll take care of it," or "I'll get back to you." When you hear these kinds of non-answers, the best thing you can do is call them out gently. Instead of accusing them of stalling, ask, "What specific steps will you take to make that happen?" This forces them to either commit or admit that they're not ready. One of the most surprising lessons in this chapter is that sometimes, giving people an easy way to say no actually makes them more likely to commit. Instead of pushing for a hard yes, try asking, "Are you sure this is something you can fully commit to?" If they say yes, it's a stronger commitment because they're reassuring themselves. But if they hesitate, it saves you from wasting time on a deal that was never real in the first place. By the end of this chapter, Voss makes one thing clear. The biggest mistake in negotiation is assuming that an agreement means the deal is done. A real negotiator doesn't just celebrate when they hear yes. They dig deeper, test commitment, and make sure the other side is truly ready to follow through. Now, Chapter 9: Bargain Hard. How to win when the pressure is on. Everyone loves a good bargain, but when the stakes are high, negotiations can get intense. Some people push aggressively, trying to intimidate you into agreeing to their terms. Others play the nice guy, making you feel guilty for asking for more. Either way, the goal is the same: to get the best possible deal for themselves. Chris Voss knows this game inside and out, and in this chapter, he reveals how to hold your ground and negotiate like a pro, no matter who you're dealing with. The chapter opens with a tense moment from one of Voss's hostage negotiations. The kidnappers had given their demands, refusing to budge. The pressure was on, and the stakes were life or death. But instead of caving in or pushing back aggressively, Voss used a technique he calls the Ackerman model. This method is designed to get you the best possible deal, while making the other side feel like they've won. It's all about strategic bargaining. Starting lower than what you're willing to pay, making calculated increases, and using empathy to guide the other person toward the outcome you want. Voss explains that most people make the mistake of negotiating in big, even chunks. If they want to pay $10,000 for something, they'll start at $5,000, then go to $7,500, then $10,000. But this kind of negotiation feels unnatural and predictable. The Ackerman model works differently. You start with an aggressive, but reasonable offer, then increase it in smaller and smaller increments. Say, 65% of your target price, then 85%, then 95%, then finally your actual goal. This makes the other person feel like they've squeezed everything out of you, even though you were always heading toward the price you wanted. The magic of this strategy is that it triggers a psychological effect called perceived value. People feel more satisfied with the deal when they feel like they had to fight for it. If you give them what they want too easily, they actually value it less. But if they believe they worked hard to get a great deal, they'll walk away feeling like they won, even if you're the one who actually came out on top. One of the most effective ways to make this technique work is to use silence strategically. People hate awkward silence. When you pause after making an offer, it creates discomfort, making them feel the need to fill the space. More often than not, they'll start negotiating against themselves, making concessions just to break the silence. Voss calls this letting the other side have your way. Instead of pushing them, you let them convince themselves to move toward your terms. This chapter also breaks down how to handle different types of bargainers. Some people come in hot, trying to intimidate you with aggression. The best way to deal with them is to stay calm and mirror their emotions without escalating. Others try to manipulate you by acting overly friendly or using guilt to make you feel bad about pushing for a better deal. Voss explains that the key to handling these tactics is to stay detached, recognize when someone is trying to play you, and stick to your plan. By the end of this chapter, one thing is clear: negotiation isn't about being the toughest person in the room. It's about being the smartest. The person who understands human psychology, stays patient, and uses strategic bargaining techniques will almost always come out ahead. Next is Chapter 10, Control the Frame, How to Shape Perception and Influence Outcomes. Negotiation isn't just about what you say, it's about how the other person perceives what you say. The way a deal is framed can completely change how it's received. A great deal can seem terrible if presented the wrong way, and a tough concession can feel like a win if framed correctly. Chris Voss calls this controlling the frame, and in this chapter, he teaches how to use strategic framing to influence decisions in your favor. Voss starts with a story about a hostage negotiation in Haiti. The kidnappers had set a ransom at a ridiculously high amount, an amount no one in their right mind would pay. If Voss had tried to argue with them outright, they would have just dug in, making the negotiation even harder. Instead, he shifted the frame. Instead of making it about the price, he subtly introduced doubt, asking, "How do we know the hostage is safe?" Suddenly, the power dynamic changed. Now, the kidnappers had to prove their value, instead of just making demands. This is the essence of framing. The goal isn't to fight someone's position head-on, it's to shift the conversation in a way that makes them see things differently. Most people think negotiation is about convincing others with logic, but the reality is that people make decisions based on emotion and perception. If you control the way a deal is presented, you control how it feels, and that gives you an edge. One of the most powerful framing techniques Voss teaches is called loss aversion. Studies show that people are far more motivated by avoiding loss than by gaining something of equal value. If you tell someone they can save $10,000, they might be interested. But if you tell them they could lose $10,000 if they don't act now, they'll feel an immediate sense of urgency. The lesson? Frame things in terms of what's at stake. Instead of saying, "This will help you. Try. If you don't do this, here's what you could lose." Another framing technique is anchoring, which is about setting the reference point in a negotiation. Voss explains that people don't judge numbers or offers in isolation, they compare them to whatever was mentioned first. If you're selling something, you might start with a higher number than what you expect to get, so that when you lower it, the other person feels like they're getting a deal. But if you're on the buying side and someone throws out an extreme number, don't panic. Instead, re-anchor the conversation by presenting a dramatically different number of your own. The point isn't necessarily to get that number, but to reset expectations so the final agreement lands somewhere in your favor. A subtle but powerful framing trick Voss shares is the "I'm sorry, but" technique. When you have to reject an offer or push back, people's natural reaction is to resist. But when you start with a soft phrase like, "I'm sorry, but," it diffuses tension and makes the other side more open to listening. Instead of saying, "That price doesn't work," try, "I'm sorry, but given our budget, we just can't justify that cost." The difference is subtle, but it makes your position feel less confrontational, making it more likely that the other person will adjust in your favor. Voss also warns against falling into the trap of their frame. Skilled negotiators will try to control the way you see the deal, making you feel like you're getting a good deal even when you're not. The key is to step back and reframe the situation for yourself. If they say, "This is the best price anyone's getting," you might respond, "How does this compare to other offers you've made?" This forces them to reveal more information and gives you room to push back. By the end of this chapter, it's clear that negotiation isn't just about what's being discussed, it's about how it's being framed. If you can shift the way the other person perceives the deal, you can control the outcome without them even realizing it. Next is Chapter 11, Find the Black Swan, the hidden piece that changes everything. Every negotiation has a hidden piece of information, something you don't know that could completely change the game. Chris Voss calls this the Black Swan, the unexpected factor that, once discovered, can flip a negotiation in your favor. This final chapter is about uncovering those hidden truths and using them to gain the ultimate advantage. Voss starts with a powerful story from a kidnapping case in the Philippines. The kidnappers were ruthless, demanding an impossible ransom and refusing to negotiate. The situation seemed hopeless, until Voss's team discovered something unexpected. Through careful listening and questioning, they learned that the kidnappers had a major weakness. They weren't just criminals, they were part of a political faction, and their funding depended on keeping a good reputation. This changed everything. Instead of negotiating like it was just about money, Voss's team subtly shifted the conversation to their public image. The kidnappers, afraid of losing face, suddenly became open to reducing their demands. The hostage was released for far less than the original ransom. That was a black swan, an unexpected piece of leverage that completely changed the situation. Black swans exist in every negotiation, whether you're talking to a business partner, a boss, or even a loved one. But most people never find them because they assume they already know everything. The key is to stay curious and look for clues. Voss explains that every person has fears, hidden desires, or outside pressures that influence their decisions. If you can uncover these, you gain massive leverage. One of the best ways to find a black swan is to ask calibrated questions and listen closely. Most people don't reveal important information outright, but they drop hints. If you're negotiating a salary and the employer says, "We're tight on budget," don't just accept that, dig deeper. Ask, "What challenges are you facing with budgets right now?" Or how do you typically work around budget constraints? Maybe you'll find out that they're actually hiring multiple people for the same role. That gives you an opening to say, "What if you invested more in one great hire instead of splitting resources?" Suddenly, you've changed the conversation. Another way to uncover black swans is to pay attention to body language and tone. Voss explains that when people hesitate, change their tone, or avoid a question, it's often a sign that something is being left unsaid. If you sense resistance, instead of pushing, mirror them. It seems like there's something you're not comfortable with. What's on your mind? People will often fill the silence with information they weren't planning to share. Voss also warns against making assumptions. If you go into a negotiation thinking you already understand the other person's position, you'll miss key details. The best negotiators stay open-minded, constantly looking for unexpected angles. He shares a story about a business deal where a company thought they were negotiating over price. But after deeper questioning, they realized the real issue wasn't money, it was security. The other side was worried about losing their jobs if the deal didn't work out. Once they addressed that fear, the deal closed instantly. The final lesson of this chapter is that negotiation is never just about numbers, it's about people. Every person you negotiate with has personal motivations, external pressures, and hidden fears. If you focus only on the surface-level conversation, you'll miss the real drivers behind their decisions. But if you dig deep, listen closely, and uncover the black swans, you'll have a level of control most people never even realize is possible. This is what separates great negotiators from everyone else. They don't just argue, they discover. They don't just talk, they listen. And because of that, they find leverage where no one else sees it. So, final takeaways is how to use these negotiation tactics in everyday life. We've covered every chapter of Never Split the Difference, breaking down the high-stakes tactics Chris Voss used in hostage negotiations, and showing how they apply to business, relationships, and everyday life. But knowledge without action is useless. Now, let's bring it all together. What are the most powerful lessons from this book, and how can you start using them right now? The first and most important takeaway is that negotiation is about emotions, not logic. Most people think the key to getting what they want is having the best argument, the most convincing facts, or the right numbers. But the truth is, people make decisions based on feelings first, then justify them with logic afterward. That's why Voss focuses so much on tactical empathy, getting inside the other person's head, understanding their fears, desires, and motivations, and making them feel heard. The simple act of labeling emotions. Saying, "It seems like you're frustrated by this," or "It sounds like you're concerned about," creates instant trust, making people more likely to open up and work with you. The second key lesson is the power of mirroring and calibrated questions. If you take nothing else from this book, remember this: when people feel understood, they are far more willing to move in your direction. Instead of pushing your agenda, make them explain their position in detail. Use subtle mirroring, repeating the last few words they said, to encourage them to talk more. Ask open-ended calibrated questions like, "How am I supposed to do that?" Or, "What would it take to make this work?" to guide them toward a solution without triggering resistance. These techniques make the other person feel like they're in control, even when you're the one shaping the outcome. Another crucial lesson is that, no is not the end, it's the beginning. Most people fear rejection in negotiations. They panic when they hear no and assume the conversation is over. But Voss teaches that no is actually the start of real negotiation. When someone says no, it often means, "I don't understand, I don't feel comfortable," or "I need more information." Instead of backing off, use this moment to ask questions, dig deeper, and uncover what's really holding them back. More often than not, the real issue is something they haven't even said out loud yet. The book also shatters the myth that the best deal is a compromise. The title Never Split the Difference is a direct attack on the idea that meeting in the middle is always the right move. If you split the difference, you're not really negotiating, you're just giving up half of what you want. Instead of aiming for fairness, aim for influence. Use anchoring to set the frame, employ loss aversion to create urgency, and structure your offers using the Ackerman model. Starting low, moving up in calculated steps, and making the other side feel like they won. One of the most powerful, and often overlooked, tools in negotiation is silence. Most people feel uncomfortable with silence, so they rush to fill it. But great negotiators know that silence creates pressure. If you make an offer and then say nothing, the other person will often negotiate against themselves, lowering their demands or making concessions just to break the awkwardness. Voss calls this letting the other side have your way. You don't have to force them, they'll convince themselves. And finally, the biggest secret to winning negotiations is to look for the black swan, the hidden piece of information that changes everything. Every negotiation has unknowns. If you assume you already know everything, you'll miss the opportunity to discover key leverage points. Stay curious, listen closely, and pay attention to what's not being said. If you can find that one crucial piece of information, whether it's a hidden fear, an external pressure, or an unexpected connection, you can turn the entire negotiation in your favor. So, how do you use these lessons in real life? Start small. The next time you negotiate for anything, a raise, a lower price, even where to go for dinner, practice mirroring, use calibrated questions, and stay silent longer than usual. Observe how people react. Notice how conversations shift when you focus on their emotions instead of just pushing your own points. Over time, these skills will become second nature. And once they do, you'll never look at negotiation the same way again. This is not just a book about business deals or hostage situations. This is a book about influence, persuasion, and human psychology. If you master these techniques, you won't just get better at negotiating, you'll get better at understanding people, navigating difficult conversations, and creating the outcomes you want in life. That wraps up Never Split the Difference. Now the real question is, how will you use these lessons? If you found this summary insightful and valuable, don't forget to show your support by subscribing to the Mindful Brief on YouTube. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this audiobook summary, share it with your peers, friends, or family who might benefit from it, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Your engagement helps us create more in-depth and valuable content for you. Stay tuned for more summaries, insights, and strategies to elevate your knowledge and career. Subscribe now and be part of the journey.